All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Seth now to talk about his project at WPI.
All right. Can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself. Okay. All right. It wasn't exactly clear. There's a lot of things to write about it, but it doesn't say in the thing that I'm actually a professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. So that's where I'm coming from, and I work with Tom and Siri as well. I'm switching gears here a little bit. We've talked a lot about waste, right? But it's mostly around the spent nuclear fuel that we've been talking about so far. I was approached by folks you might know with the Citizens Awareness Network. They worked around from Yankee Row, which is out near where we live, or was near where we live in Row, Massachusetts. It's been closed, and Vermont Yankee to close that down. And monitor the commissioning process now. I talked to them, and they had this project in mind. If you know Deb Katz, she has this way of talking, and she said, "We want to make the invisible visible." And what she meant was that so much of what happens around nuclear waste is invisible to people and in communities. Um, uh, and they were particularly interested not just in the spent nuclear fuel, so the high level waste and where that would go. Talked about deep geological repositories and things, but what happens to the low level radioactive waste, which is all the other stuff that becomes radioactively contaminated through the nuclear um, through the process of the nuclear power plants. So where does that go? And there's several sites around the country where it's shipped to, and their idea is how to build a network among communities where they're generating nuclear energy, but also the communities that then would be subject to having to host nuclear waste, right? As because the bigger the network around the country, the more power communities have around these kinds of issues. So that was really the idea. So we started a project around trying to track where the low-level radioactive waste from New England reactors goes. And we started with Pilgrim, but then we expanded that into Seabrook and okay, to do all my slides here, right? But to Seabrook and to Vermont Yankee. Right now there's a spent nuclear fuel, as Tom was talking about. There's no program for where that should go. Um, and there's about 600 metric tons of it stored now on site at Seabrook, just like all the other power plants around the country. And then there's low level radioactive waste. And basically, that's everything that's not spent nuclear fuel, right? So there's a lot of different isotopes that are part of that. Some of them are short lived, they decay pretty rapidly, but some of them are also like plutonium that last tens and thousands of years. So it's not really like low level just means it's not high level. It doesn't mean that it's not significant. I'm not going to go into details, but there's three classes that are defined by the radioactivity. Connecting to the small modular reactors is that they're likely to generate more low-level radioactive waste per megawatt of electricity produced than the larger power plants. It just has to do with physics, and I recently had an exchange with Alison McFarland about why that happens. And also, some of the designs are going to require the processing of waste before they can be disposed of in a deep geologic repository, which would generate lots of additional low-level radioactive waste, different kinds of fluids and not just solid materials. So that's what we're trying to pay attention to here. So the project was to highlight where does it go from New England reactors, and the NRC has the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a database where every shipment of low-level radioactive waste that goes out of a power plant is supposed to be recorded. What's the volume? What is the Curie count? What is the radioactivity? And also, at least in some cases, what are the isotopes? And that record keeping has evolved over the years. And I'll just say right off the bat that one of the things that we found is that a lot of there's missing data, there's incorrect data. It's not always easy to figure out where things have gone or how much of it is there. So we're going through all that. Well, I have students doing a lot of this work. And right now we're trying to think of different ways to visualize different parameters of this waste, like the volume, the radioactivity, the isotope composition, how many shipments, where did they go, um, and what's the long-term burden to these host communities for the waste. We're going to be putting it on a website. We have a website right now around Pilgrim that we produce. If you go to Pan's website, you can probably find it. We're doing that. And so I just want to show you some examples of what we're doing. They're drafts. So we're still working through this, and I'd love input from anybody now or later on about what these are like, because we want to make them very accessible. But the first one is, where does the waste go? And one of the things about the waste is a lot of it goes straight to these facilities. And there's one in South Carolina, Barnwell. There's one in Texas now, Waste Control Specialist. There's one in Utah, in Clyde, Utah. But a lot of it right now goes to these intermediate processing facilities. And a lot of that has to do with compressing solid waste, right? Um, so the interesting thing about that is that it's maybe hard to read this, but I'll just say that the one on the right here is on the left is where all the waste from Seabrook, the low-level radioactive waste, and which of the three waste facilities it goes to around the country. The top one is in Energy Solutions in Barnwell, South Carolina. This one's in Utah, and this one's in Texas. Right, so most of it had gone to Barnwell over time. But on the left, and we're trying to figure out how to integrate these. On the left is all the waste first goes to these intermediate processing facilities. And we have the records show where it goes, its first destination. But all the stuff that leaves those intermediate processing facilities, we don't know often where it ends up. So it's hard to track what is actually how much waste is where. And so, like the top two on the intermediate ones, they're part of Energy Solutions, the same company. So probably they ended up in Barnwell, but we don't actually know that from the records. And so we're trying to figure that out. I'll bet these waste facilities know how much they're receiving, but that's not part of the public, right? All we have in the public record is from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we're struggling with how to present this. This is the total number of shipments per year that came out of Seabrook. I'm just going to point out one thing here is you could start to see in 2000, right after the accident in 2008, their shipments went up. I don't know what happened in 2000, but and it also could have just been that there was some construction going on, right? This isn't all like nefarious. It could also be kind of routine stuff. This is the number of shipments. And if you have a lot of concrete, for example, it takes up a lot of shipments, right? In this figure, we're trying to show some combinations of things. The blue line is the number of shipments annually. And then the pink and the blue at the bottom has to do with the volume of waste that was sent out and the radioactivity of the waste. And there again, in 2002 and 2008, you can see a lot of that's tritium that was being sent off site after that event, right? And so we're trying to show this. I'll leave it there. We have other things too. One of the things that we are trying to also show is if we know how much cesium-137 was sent to Barnwell, and we know how much tritium was sent to Barnwell, and we know how much plutonium was sent to Barnwell, is what's the lifetime of those isotopes in those places, right? And we can show the decay series. And so tritium, in the next 30, 40 years, if no more was sent there, it would decay over that time significantly. Things like cobalt or strontium can take a lot longer. The curve for plutonium is essentially flat because its half-life is so long. So the idea there is going back to what we're working with CAN is to help communities and those waste communities understand what their connection is with folks like you and around here, around Seabrook, yeah, and trying to build bridges and think about ways to empower both communities to actively either promote things that are safer or fight against these kinds of things. So I'm going to end our presentation there and just say thank you. This is sort of a summary of some of the things that we were trying to raise questions about is Purdue Nuclear, SMRs, where will they be located? Who's going to decide where they're located and what they're like? What burdens will communities and ratepayers face? Especially Tom said if they go south, right? We haven't ever done these before. And then where are the wastes going to go? These are big questions and I'd be happy to talk about them more.